In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said, every jot and every tittle of the law of God will be fulfilled. The jot and the tittle were the smallest letter and the smallest marking on the letters in the Hebrew alphabet. Jesus was saying the scriptures will be fulfilled down to the smallest letter and down to the smallest markings on the letters. Jesus had a very high view of the scriptures. Now, there are some today, many today, in fact, who say, well, the Bible contains the thoughts of God, or godly principles, or godly lessons, but the actual words are not God's words, or the actual words are not really that important. It's really just the principles that we're looking at here, but the words are the words of men. They're not the words of God. Jesus took the words to be God's words, and he even took the letters and the markings of the letters and the tenses of the words, the tenses of the verbs, to be inspired. And he makes the case for life after death and a continuation of our relationship with God after we die on the tense of one word in Exodus chapter 3. And I point that out to ask you the question, do you have the same view of the Bible as Jesus does? Or do you think you know more about the Bible than Jesus? And that we don't need to take, the words aren't important, or not all the words are from God. Jesus had a very high view of the inspiration of Scripture. Now, verse 33 says, and when the multitudes heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. Now, note, it's the multitudes here who were astonished at his teaching. And by now, the crowd, I'm sure, has grown even larger in size as more people have come into the courts and have kind of seen what's going on and gathered around to watch this exchange with the religious leaders. Now, after this, the Sadducees did not ask Jesus any more questions. I mean, this just put them in their place, and they walk away. They're done, which is pretty smart. But look at verse 34. But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, that they were not going to ask any more questions, well, then they gathered together. They huddle up. What can we ask him to catch him? And then one of them, verse 35, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him and saying, Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? Now, when it says lawyer here, this means an expert in the law of Moses. And this lawyer, he seems to be genuinely asking this question. Mark's account of this tells us the lawyer was standing there listening to the debate between Jesus and the Sadducees. And Mark's account says that he realized that Jesus had answered them well. He stood there and thought, wow, that's a really good answer. And so then he asked, Teacher, which is the great commandment? So again, it seems that his question is actually sincere. When it says he asked, testing him, the word means to test, to prove the quality of. He's not trying to trick him with this question. He's like, man, he answered that last question really well. I'm going to ask him another question, and I want to see how he answers that question. And this question is about the great commandment. What's the great commandment? And this was a question that was often debated among the religious leaders and the rabbis at that time. Which is the great commandment in the law of Moses? There are 613 laws in the law of Moses. And so the religious leaders, the rabbis in that day, they debated which one is the greatest or the most important law in the law of Moses. Jesus immediately answered, verse 37, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. He said, this is the first and great commandment. And the second, they didn't ask for the second, but he's going to give it to them anyways. The second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus quoted Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5, which is part of the Shema that Jewish people prayed every day, and they still pray every day. And then he quotes Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. Again, he said, the great commandment is, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. That means you love God with all that you are. You love God with your whole being, your whole life. This is what God desires from every one of us, that we would love him with all of our being, with every ounce of our being. And this is the most important commandment in the Bible according to Jesus. And he said the second one is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now this does not mean you have to learn to love yourself first so that you can then love your neighbor as yourself. You don't need to learn to love yourself because you already love yourself. Jesus is saying love your neighbor just as you already love yourself. And so when it comes to my neighbor, what would I want for myself? What would I want someone to do for me if I were in their situation? That's loving your neighbor as yourself. And these two commandments, they sum up all of the law, all 613 laws in the law of Moses. Romans 13:10 says, love is the fulfillment of the law. Love is the fulfillment of the law. The Apostle Paul summarized the entire law of Moses with one word: love.